Welcome to the Manual Test Report, OpenWeatherMap API Testing. Introduction. This report documents the manual API testing process for the OpenWeatherMap Forecast API. The testing focuses on ensuring accurate data retrieval and proper error handling for various request scenarios. Scope of testing. Functional testing. Verification of successful data retrieval with valid parameters. Validation of error handling for invalid or missing parameters. Testing of optional parameter functionality. Error handling. Identification and validation of error responses for incorrect inputs. Verification of appropriate HTTP status codes for different error scenarios. Test environment. API endpoint, api.openweathermap.org/data/2.5/forecast. Testing tool, Postman. Testing date, April 11, 2025. Test scenarios and results. ID, 001 valid request with minimum required parameters. Purpose, establishes baseline functionality with minimal parameters to confirm core API capabilities. Parameters used, lat equals 44.34, lon equals 10.99, appid equals your_API_key, coordinates for Medina, Italy. What's being tested? The API's ability to return forecast data with just required inputs without any customization. Testing context. This is the foundation test that all other tests build upon. It confirms the API can handle minimal configuration. Technical details. Default response should include atmospheric variables, temp, pressure, humidity, wind data, cloud coverage, and precipitation forecasts. Expected behavior. Returns a complete 5-day forecast in the default unit, Kelvin, with 3-hour interval timestamps, 40 timestamps total. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 200 OK. ID, 002 valid request with metric units. Purpose, verifies unit conversion functionality from default Kelvin to the more commonly used Celsius scale. Parameters added, units equals metric, in addition to base parameters. What's being tested? The API's ability to convert temperature units and provide consistently converted values across all data points. Testing context, essential for applications serving users outside the US, particularly in Europe and Asia. Technical details, should convert not just temperatures but also affect wind speed units, meters/second instead of default. Expected behavior, same response structure as test 001 but with temperatures in Celsius, typically ranging from -50 to +50, and appropriate metric units for wind speed. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 200 OK with temperatures correctly displayed in Celsius and all related measurements in metric units. Temperature values should be numerically different from test 001. ID, 003 valid request with XML response mode. Purpose, tests format conversion capabilities for systems that require XML instead of JSON. Parameters added, mode equals XML, in addition to base parameters. What's being tested? Response format flexibility and proper handling of content type headers. Testing context, important for legacy systems or enterprise integrations that specifically require XML. Technical details, XML structure should maintain all the same data points as JSON but an XML hierarchy with proper nesting. Expected behavior, content in XML format with proper XML content type header. All forecast data should be preserved in XML structure. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 200 OK with content type application/XML and valid XML data that can be parsed by standard XML parsers. Should contain same weather data as test 001 but in XML format. ID, 004 valid request with CNT parameter. Purpose, tests data quantity limiting to optimize bandwidth and processing requirements. Parameters added, CNT equals 5, in addition to base parameters. What's being tested? The API's ability to control response size and respect specific quantity requests. Testing context, critical for mobile applications or limited bandwidth scenarios where full data set is not needed. Technical details, default response contains 40 timestamps, 3-hour intervals for 5 days, this test limits to first 5 timestamps only. Expected behavior, response with exactly 5 forecast entries covering the first 15 hours of forecast. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 200 OK with JSON containing exactly 5 forecast entries in the list array instead of the default 40. Data structure should remain identical to test 001 except for reduced quantity. ID 005 valid request with language parameter. Purpose, tests internationalization capabilities for creating localized user experiences. Parameters added, lang equals fr, in addition to base parameters. What's being tested, text translation functionality for weather descriptions only. Testing context, essential for applications with international user base to provide native language descriptions. Technical details, only affects text descriptions of weather conditions, clear sky, light rain, etc., not data units or structure. Expected behavior, weather condition descriptions in French, e.g. ciel de gauge instead of clear sky. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 200 OK with weather descriptions correctly translated to French in the description field inside weather arrays. ID 006 valid request with imperial units. Purpose, tests alternate unit system for US-based applications and users. Parameters added, units equals imperial, in addition to base parameters. What's being tested, full imperial unit conversion system across all measurements. Testing context, required for US-based applications where users expect Fahrenheit temperatures and mph wind speeds. Technical details, affects multiple data points including temperatures, Fahrenheit, wind speed, mph, and potentially other measurements. Expected behavior, temperatures in Fahrenheit, typically ranging from -60 to +120, wind speeds in miles/hour. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 200 OK with temperatures in Fahrenheit and wind speeds in miles/hour. Values should be numerically different from both test 001 and 002, with temperature values approximately 1.8 times higher +32 compared to Celsius values. ID 007 valid request with all parameters. Purpose, tests parameter compatibility to ensure all options can be combined without conflicts. Parameters added, CNT equals 10, units equals metric, mode equals JSON, lang equals ES, combined with base parameters. What's being tested, parameter interaction and coexistence without unexpected side effects. Testing context, validates complex API usage scenarios that might occur in sophisticated applications. Technical details, combines language customization, unit conversion, and quantity limiting in a single request. Expected behavior, response with 10 forecast entries, not 40, in Spanish descriptions, cielo claro instead of clear sky, metric units, JSON format. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 200 OK with 10 forecast entries, descriptions in Spanish, and metric units, validates that all parameter processors work together without conflict. ID 008 coordinate edge case equator and prime meridian. Purpose, tests geographic edge case at a significant global reference point. Parameters used, lat equals 0, lon equals 0, Gulf of Guinea, off west coast of Africa. What's being tested, geographic coordinate handling at the map origin point. Testing context, important edge case where both coordinates are 0, a potential source of division by 0 errors in some systems. Technical details, the coordinates 0, 0 point to a valid location in the Atlantic Ocean near Africa, not a null location. Expected behavior, valid forecast for Gulf of Guinea region with normal weather patterns for that tropical location. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 200 OK with valid forecast data for the Gulf of Guinea region, should contain reasonable tropical temperature values and expected weather patterns for that equatorial region. ID 009 high latitude and longitude limits. Purpose, test geographic boundary conditions at the maximum possible coordinate values. Parameters used, lat equals 90, lon equals 180, North Pole and International Date Line intersection. What's being tested, handling of extreme coordinates at the edge of the coordinate system. Testing context, important edge case that might trigger boundary errors in some geographic calculations. Technical details, these coordinates represent the theoretical maximum values in the coordinate system. Lat equals 90 is North Pole, lon equals 180 is the international date line. Expected behavior, either valid data for the polar region or an appropriate empty result if weather stations unavailable. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 200 OK with either valid polar region data, extreme cold temperatures, potential ice conditions, or an appropriate empty result with clear indication that data is unavailable for this location. Invalid requests. ID, 010 invalid request, missing APID. Purpose, tests authentication requirements and security enforcement. Parameters omitted, APID, authentication token. What's being tested, authentication validation and proper error handling for unauthenticated requests. Testing context, confirms API isn't accessible without proper authentication, protecting both the service and user data. Technical details, the request is technically valid in structure but missing the required authentication parameter. Expected behavior, 401 error with invalid API key message indicating authentication failure. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 401 unauthorized with invalid API key error message. Response body should include a clear error code and message explaining the authentication requirement. ID, 011 invalid API key. Purpose, tests authentication security against invalid credentials. Parameters modified, APID equals invalid underscore key, deliberately incorrect API key. What's being tested, API key validation process and security response. Testing context, confirms security measures reject not just missing credentials but invalid ones as well. Technical details, the request structure is valid but the authentication token is not recognized. Expected behavior, 401 error with invalid API key message, same as missing key but testing specific validation logic. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 401 unauthorized with invalid API key error message, should be indistinguishable from response in test 010 to prevent security information leakage. PI key error message, response body should include a clear error code and message explaining the authentication requirement. ID, 012 invalid request, unsupported language code. Purpose, tests parameter validation with fallback for optional settings. Parameters modified, lang equals XYZ, a deliberately non-existent language code. What's being tested, error handling with fallback logic for non-critical parameters. Testing context, verifies graceful handling of invalid optional parameters without rejecting the entire request. Technical details, the request is valid except for an unsupported language specification that should trigger a fallback. Expected behavior, success response with default English language descriptions instead of failing. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 200 OK with weather descriptions in default English language, should functionally match the response from test 001 despite the invalid language parameter. ID, 013 non-numeric latitude and longitude. Purpose, tests data type validation for critical geographic parameters. Parameters modified, lat equals ABC, lon equals XYZ, text values where numbers are required. What's being tested, input type checking and validation for core parameters. Testing context, verifies API properly enforces data types on critical inputs before processing. Technical details, the request attempts to use string values for parameters that must be numeric. Expected behavior, 400 error with message about wrong coordinates or invalid data types. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 400 bad request with wrong latitude or wrong longitude error message. Response should clearly indicate the type mismatch problem. ID, 014 overload with excessive parameters. Purpose, tests parameter overloading and conflicting values handling. Parameters added, multiple unnecessary and duplicate parameters including a conflicting APID value. What's being tested, request parsing robustness and conflict resolution. Testing context validates how API handles messy requests with redundant or conflicting information. Technical details includes duplicate Appd parameter which should cause authentication conflict. Expected behavior 401 error due to conflicting Appd values creating an authentication problem. Expected result pass when API returns HTTP 401 unauthorized with error message for conflicting parameters, tests the API's ability to detect parameter conflicts. ID 015 missing all required parameters. Purpose tests minimum requirement enforcement and basic request validation. Parameters omitted, all required parameters, completely empty request. What's being tested, basic request validation and error messaging clarity. Testing context, verifies system behavior with completely invalid/empty request. Technical details, no parameters at all, testing the most basic level of request validation. Expected behavior, either 400 error, bad request format, or 401 error, missing authentication. Expected result, pass when API returns either HTTP 400 bad request or 401 unauthorized with appropriate error message. Either response is valid depending on which validation occurs first. ID 016 missing latitude. Purpose tests partial coordinate validation when only one coordinate is missing. Parameters omitted, latitude only. What's being tested, specific parameter dependency checking for coordinate pairs. Testing context validates that API requires both coordinates, not just any single one. Technical details provides longitude and authentication but no latitude. Expected behavior 400 error with specific message about missing latitude or geocoding failure. Expected result pass when API returns HTTP 400 bad request with nothing to geocode error message. Tests specific handling of the latitude parameter. ID 017 missing longitude. Purpose tests partial coordinate validation, complementary to test 019. Parameters omitted, longitude only. What's being tested, specific parameter dependency checking for the other coordinate. Testing context, companion test to 019, confirming both coordinates are individually validated. Technical details, provides latitude and authentication but no longitude. Expected behavior, 400 error with specific message about missing longitude. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 400 bad request with error message about missing longitude, should mirror test 019 but for longitude specifically. ID 018 empty API key. Purpose tests authentication edge case with present but empty credential. Parameters modified, Appd equals, parameter exists but has empty value. What's being tested, empty string validation in authentication process. Testing context, edge case between missing parameter, test 010, and invalid parameter, test 012. Technical details, the parameter exists but contains no value, testing empty string handling. Expected behavior, 401 error with invalid API key message, treating empty as invalid. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 401 unauthorized with invalid API key error message, should be treated equivalently to an invalid key. ID 019 incorrect HTTP method. Purpose tests HTTP method validation and RESTful API compliance. Method changed, post instead of get, inappropriate method for data retrieval. What's being tested, protocol compliance and HTTP method enforcement. Testing context validates that API follows RESTful principles by enforcing appropriate HTTP methods. Technical details, same parameters as test 001 but using post method instead of get. Expected behavior, 405 error about method not allowed for this endpoint. Expected result, pass when API returns HTTP 405 method not allowed with error message indicating unsupported method, confirms proper implementation of HTTP protocol constraint.